Wrestling is awesome. And when something is awesome, people generally want to do that thing. But then, you realize that you'll have to take bumps like this, or this, or for some demented reason, this. So at this point, if you want to experience wrestling, you're either one of the few people with superhuman pain tolerance, or you go for the second best option. Wrestling games have been around almost as long as gaming itself. The first one was even published before the first Super Mario Bros. From the arcade cabinets to modern gaming consoles, none have been more synonymous with wrestling games than the WWE itself. If you own a gaming console, there is a WWE game for it, and in this video, I'll be covering the entire history of the WWE games. As a bonus, I'll also be covering every WCW, TNA, ECW and AEW game, as I think that looking at what WWE's competitors were doing at the time will give us valuable insight about the WWE games as well. Let's get right to it. Before we get into the WWE games themselves, it's important to see the short evolution of wrestling games up to that point. The first one ever released was a 1983 Japanese arcade game called Tag Team Wrestling. The game is predictably very archaic by today's standards, but all the basics are here. You can kick, grapple, and even fight outside the ring. The game was fairly successful, even topping the arcade charts for that year's January and February in Japan. The following years after Tag Team Wrestling's release, wrestling games were being made exclusively in Japan. In 1985, Technos, the devs behind Tag Team Wrestling, released Mania, the Pro Wrestling Network, and the difference between these two games is night and day. Look at how much cleaner and smoother everything looks. Despite that, I can't really focus on the gameplay because one of your opponents is called Insane Warrior, which is probably a misspelling of Insane Warrior. I guess his gimmick is crippling anxiety. The game was a massive success, being the third highest grossing game in the United States in 1986. The first fully licensed game would actually be Tag Team Match Muscle, as it was based on a Japanese manga called Kinnikuman. However, this licensing would not carry over to the US as the manga was not well known outside of Japan. The same would apply for All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling first game, which was named after Dump Matsumoto. The game featured real women wrestlers in Japan, but when ported in the US as Pro Wrestling for the Master System, the game only featured fictitious male wrestlers. I do love the cover of the US version, however, because there's nothing that screams wrestling more than a beheading. Finally, a few months after Pro Wrestling's release, Pro Wrestling was released. No, I'm not having a stroke, but if you think having two Call of Duty Modern Warfares released within 15 years of one another was bad, wait till you see two Pro Wrestlings released within a few months of one another. Pro Wrestling for the NES was Nintendo's attempt at simulating the sport, and the results were great. The game's probably the most in-depth wrestling game we've seen up to now, featuring legally distinct Hogan, a variety of moves, and a referee that is more than a prop. This game was very well received. It was deemed as Computer Gaming World's Sports Game of the Year, with a reviewer praising the game, mentioning its graphics, non-stop action, and real wrestling moves. The reviewer even went as far to say that Pro Wrestling was the only game that really understood what it was simulating. Pro Wrestling is also where the meme "A Winner Is You" originates from, which by today's standards is almost as old as the game itself. The year is 1987. Hulkamania is still running wild, with him power slamming Andre the Giant for definitely the first time ever in the main event of WrestleMania 3. Despite that event having over 90,000 fans in attendance, an even bigger event occurred in 87, the release of the first WWF licensed video game. Now, up to this point, while some games may have been better than others, they all functioned under the same principles. A beat-em-up game similar to the likes of Double Dragon, with the ability to perform wrestling-related moves and pin your opponent. You'd expect that the first WWF licensed game would be that, but with a WWF flavor. You'd also be very wrong. Micro League Wrestling is a text-based strategy game where you get to play a tiny variety of one-on-one matches with actual WWF wrestlers. You pick a move, your opponent picks a move, and then the game decides what will play out on the screen. The images the game uses are taken from when the wrestlers actually faced each other, and the end result is very fascinating. Due to the aforementioned reason, the wrestlers or even matches you can have are very limited, but I find Micro League's concept very interesting, and I'd love to see someone expand upon it with modern technology. It's surprisingly novel to press buttons and seeing the actual wrestlers acted out using a PowerPoint. There are also pre-match promos that wrestlers cut before the match, as well as text-based commentary by Vince McMahon and Jesse Ventura, something that is somehow very topical in 2025. I couldn't find a lot of info on Microleague, the company that made the game, but according to a Reddit post, they shut down soon after releasing the game, despite being in the midst of developing an expansion pack for it. According to the Reddit user, he did receive a new match, but it felt rushed compared to the rest of the game, and I couldn't find gameplay of that specific match. Despite the novelty of Microleague Wrestling, the WWF would have to make a more traditional wrestling game at some point, and that came in the form of WWF WrestleMania, made by Rare. This feels wrong in so many ways. What are they doing here? Just a few years later, Rare would go on to make legendary games like Donkey Kong Country, GoldenEye, and Kinect Sports Rivals. Yet they made this game. The publisher Acclaim Entertainment is also noteworthy because about a decade later they would get into a bunch of controversies, including paying any parents that would name their kids Turok, attempting to purchase advertising space on tombstones, and a plan to reimburse anybody that got a speeding ticket that was promptly shut down by the UK's government. I may have gotten a bit sidetracked, but the game itself isn't anything special. The gameplay is fairly generic compared to other games we've seen so far, and the game apparently predicted the pandemic era because you're wrestling in a dark void. However, this is probably the first attempt at personalizing the moves of wrestlers, as the 6 available superstars all have slight variations on what they can do in the ring. Its tournament mode is also noteworthy, as it's the first game that didn't just have you playing singular matches with nothing at stake. Still, when I saw that Rare made a wrestling game, I expected a lot more than this. That wasn't the only wrestling game licensed by a major company that was released in 1989, as another up-and-coming lesser-known promotion would also be making their first foray into the gaming world. WCW's game actually looks a lot better than Rare's game, and it has an interesting story behind it. This game was named Superstar Pro Wrestling in Japan, and it featured a short list of real-life wrestlers like Antonio Inoki, Bruiser Brody, and Stan Hansen. But when it was ported over to the US, it was renamed to World Championship Wrestling, and nearly every wrestler on its roster was switched out for a WCW wrestler. This game was ahead of its time, as you're fighting in front of actual fans and not a dark void, you have limited customization of your wrestler's moveset, and each wrestler has their own unique finisher. To my knowledge and research, this is the first time finishers were introduced in a licensed wrestling game, and probably the first time they ever existed in a wrestling game. It's wild to think that a staple of wrestling games for the next 35 years would originate from a company that was not even competing with the WWF. Back to the WWF, they would release one more game in 1989. Someone in there definitely took note of unlicensed games like Tag Team Pro Wrestling and Mat Mania being major hits in arcades, so they decided that they needed a WWF licensed arcade game. Who did they assign that work to? None other than Technos, the company behind the two aforementioned games. This game is cool. You can tell Technos were making wrestling games for more than 5 years at that moment, and they got the most out of WWF Superstars despite it being an arcade exclusive. The gameplay is a better version of their other unlicensed games, but I want to focus on the things outside of the matches. This is the first WWF game to feature entrances, short as they were, as well as voice promos from people that definitely were not the people they were portraying.
No one can beat Megabucks.
I'll put you to sleep with my $1 million dream.
While WCW may have won the battle in the home console department, WWF Superstars was a massive hit in both Japan and the United States. 1990 would see only one game, that being Rare's second attempt at the wrestling genre, WWF WrestleMania Challenge. WrestleMania Challenge ditches the 2D angle in favor of an isometric approach, but compared to WCW's and Techno's games, this still feels underwhelming. At least there's no more void, but the game feels lacking in presentation compared to its rivals. I found a review of it from GamePro that rated the game on a scale of 5 happy faces. The reviewer loved the gameplay, but found the experience in general to not be challenging enough. I don't know how Rare managed to have the worst wrestling game of the bunch, but I guess they were miscast for the role. That, and releasing a staggering 34 games between 1989 and 1990. That's almost 1.5 games per month. I can imagine why the wrestling games were not up to par. 1991 would see the release of 3 different titles, all for a variety of devices. First up, we have another WWF WrestleMania made by Twilight for computers running DOS. The game featured only 3 playable characters, but they all look amazing. I found an old review of the game giving it a 91%, and the reviewer mentioned how stunning the graphics look. I usually get a little chuckle when older reviews mention that about games with less pixels than the current WWE's roster, but no, this is by far the best looking game we've seen so far. The sprites are real good representations of the wrestlers, considering the era's limitations. Before each match, wrestlers cut promos as well, shown in the scientifically engineered worst way possible for readability. The gameplay itself is solid, especially with all three wrestlers having their own signature move. Meanwhile, Technos was back, this time with a sequel to WWF Superstars called WWF WrestleFest. You can really feel the energy with this one. Twilight's WrestleMania was a very quiet game to the point that you could hear the wrestlers' grunts. But WrestleFest is oozing with adrenaline. I guess it's the difference between a PC game and an arcade game made to entice you to spend money on it. The sprites are also much improved here, although a review from Zero criticizes them for being cartoony. What was the reviewer expecting? I'm sorry, I wasn't alive during that time, but my brain can't comprehend the big difference between this and this. Anyways, this game is the first one to include a Royal Rumble mode, as well as steel cage matches. The roster was also the biggest ever with 12 playable wrestlers. Technos really hit their stride during that time. 1991 would be the year that WWF would release its first handheld title, once again called WWF Superstars. This was also made by Rare, but it isn't anything special. It's actually very similar to their first wrestling game, WWF WrestleMania. This is just a game made to get the Game Boy's player base and not much else. I love the pre-match promos and the music is always great in Rare's wrestling games, but that's about it. Nintendo Power seemed to love it, but this review feels more like an ad than anything else. I mean, the words crisp Game Boy graphics are really pushing it, even for its era. 1992 saw the release of WWF European Rampage Tour made by Arc Developments, a game that released only in Europe for computers running DOS. It's the first WWF game to include wrestlers' themes that are not done in 8-bit, as well as the Legion of Doom's catchphrase done by the wrestlers themselves. The presentation is also great, with the arena brimming with life. Unfortunately, the game is not up to par as it's sluggish and doesn't offer a great variety of things to do. 1992 would also be the year that the WWF released games for the newer generation consoles, the Sega Genesis and the SNES. WWF Super WrestleMania was a game published by Acclaim once again, but this time made by Sculptured Software, with Rare nowhere to be found. It's easy to tell that a technological leap happened when you look at Super WrestleMania. The wrestlers look better than ever, while the animations are looking very smooth. The gameplay itself though is once again very bare bones. Animations look good, but at the cost of there not being a lot of them. The SNES and Genesis versions had key differences as well, with the Genesis version being the only one to have signature moves, with the SNES version having 2 more wrestlers to choose from. Both games had their own exclusive rosters, with only 3 out of the 18 wrestlers total, that being Hogan, Matchman and Ted DiBiase, being in both games. Reviews of the game were generally positive. The WWF still wanted to take advantage of the NES's player base, and thus WWF WrestleMania Steel Cage Challenge was released for the NES and Game Gear. Yeah, this is a cash grab if I've ever seen one. The game looks worse than its predecessors, and the wrestlers themselves have zero distinctive qualities. For a game called Steel Cage Challenge, they even got the Steel Cage match wrong, as you win by climbing to the top of it instead of leaving it. The Game Gear version is even worse, as you fight with characters ripped straight from Lisa the Painful. A review by Sega Master Force mentions that the moveset is limited, how the game requires little skill, and that a lot of the times you'll be doing things by accident. A sequel to WWF Superstars, called Superstars 2, was also made for the Game Boy by the same devs behind Super WrestleMania. The game ditches the green filter for a black and white approach, although there isn't much I can say about it. Everything is very basic, but how much could we expect out of a Game Boy wrestling game? If you were dying to play a wrestling game on the go, I guess it could satisfy that craving, but there isn't a lot to it. 1993 would see another 3 WWF games released, starting with WWF Royal Rumble. A sequel to Super WrestleMania, Royal Rumble would be an improvement on every front. More match types, more moves, and even more wrestlers in the ring, Royal Rumble was a solid game. Even the SNES version got signature moves, although both the SNES and Genesis versions once again had their own exclusive wrestlers. Despite this not being the first time a Royal Rumble mode existed in a WWF game, I believe this would be the first time you could eliminate your opponents by throwing them over the top rope. This game was generally received positively, with Nintendo Magazine System mentioning how Royal Rumble rectified a lot of the previous game's problems, but still didn't warrant an upgrade if you owned the first one. Rage in a Cage, besides sounding like someone used a thesaurus on Hell in a Cell, is probably one of the best games of the era. The game has tons of energy, moves that not only look good but also have a lot of fluidity, the biggest wrestler roster up to this point, and you have matches with introductions done by Mean Gene Okerlund himself.
To my left, From Washington, D.C., weighing 248 pounds, Erwin R. Shyster, otherwise known as IRS.
Rage in a Cage was a Sega CD exclusive, and it feels so ahead of its time. The game has a lot of flair, something that I felt like the SNES games were lacking. There isn't a single thing done here that doesn't add to the experience. I mean, look at the FMV scenes from when you win the championship. Great stuff all around. Rounding up 1993 and the Golden Era games in general, we had WWF King of the Ring released for the NES and Game Boy. After moving to newer gen consoles, the quality really dipped for the NES games. This also feels like a cheap cash grab, with both the NES and Game Boy versions being bare bones and looking a lot worse than their predecessors. Not to worry though, as the WWF would have to step its game up as a war was coming. By 1994, WCW would be preparing for an all-out war with the WWF, and a year later, Monday Nitro was created to compete with Raw. But while the WWF and WCW were battling it out with the ratings, what were these two companies doing in the gaming world? Well, in 1994 we got WWF Raw. It would release for a wide variety of consoles, and it's a sequel to Rage in the Cage. For the first time ever, each wrestler has their own unique moveset, as well as the ability to perform mega moves. Mega moves are completely over-the-top moves that are hilarious to look at. They include things like Bret doing a 450 splash, Taker's punch setting people to the Shadow Realm, and best of all, Yokozuna performing a cannonball from the top rope. The game also had the usual improvements like more wrestlers and match types, but it was lambasted by reviewers at the time, who criticized the game's graphics and unfair AI. Most of Raw's versions look and play fine, besides the Game Boy version, which is the same game only in name. From 1994, however, WCW would be fully entering the video game world, creating another front in the war with the WWF. In that year, two WCW games were released: WCW Super Brawl Wrestling for the SNES, and the main event for the Game Boy. This would also be the beginning of an avalanche of wrestling games that wouldn't stop until 2005. Super Brawl Wrestling feels like a step back from everything we've seen so far. It's an SNES exclusive, but feels more like one of the bad WWF NES titles. The presentation is solid, but wrestlers don't have unique movesets and everything is very sluggish. Critics weren't a fan of this one, with GamePro mentioning how Super Brawl Wrestling had the makings of a good game, but it's let down by its gameplay. The WWF easily won the home console battle, but what about the handheld one? WCW The Main Event is once again an example of a not very good Game Boy game. Wrestlers would be unrecognizable did they not have their names under them, and gameplay was simplistic but not really fun. Still, it's the only WCW game that includes Stone Cold Steve Austin, with hair no less, as well as Dustin Rhodes before he became Goldust, so at least there's that. An NES version of the game apparently exists according to Wikipedia, but I couldn't find anything about it, so if you know anything more, please let me know. I would say the WWF won this battle too, but their Game Boy games also sucked, so let's call this a draw. 1995 would see the release of only one licensed wrestling game, and that would be WWF WrestleMania, the arcade game. Initially an arcade game obviously, it would soon be ported to every major console, including the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn for the first time ever. This is more of a beat 'em up with wrestling moves rather than a wrestling game. Characters have health bars and most moves are very exaggerated or even use the supernatural in the Undertaker's case. The game looks like a ton of fun. Some versions of the game are worse than others, but the arcade and PlayStation versions were lauded for their graphics, commentary similar to NBA Jam, and fast-paced gameplay. I mean, look at how happy these faces look. This was also the first wrestling game to use the images of wrestlers as sprites, similar to what Mortal Kombat was doing. There's also a really cool clip uploaded recently by the WWE Vault channel, where Triple H and Goldust are seen playing and enjoying the game, while The Undertaker looks on with sheer disdain in the background. 1996 would also only see one game being released, called WWF In Your House. In Your House is an example of Mortal Kombat's success and influence at the time, as this is clearly a fighting game. Wrestlers move with extreme speed while also having their own unique arena. Even the announcer shouting "pin him" is reminiscent of the Mortal Kombat announcer saying "fatality", which is also appropriately followed by legitimately killing the losing wrestler. Acclaim was not in a good financial situation during the making of this game, and it didn't get a lot of attention in general. This game got pretty bad reviews, with the GameSpot reviewer saying that if you're looking for a serious wrestling game, this isn't it. And yeah, if you wanted a wrestling game, this wasn't it, and if you wanted to play Mortal Kombat, you'd just play Mortal Kombat. 1997 would be dominated by WCW. They published 2 games that year, WCW vs. the World and WCW vs. NWO World Tour, both published by THQ. WCW vs. the World was a PS1 exclusive, and they did the same thing they did with their first game. They took a Japanese wrestling game, changed the branding, and brought it over to the US. This game features 9 WCW wrestlers and an abundance of legally distinct ones, making for the largest wrestling roster of any game at the time. While the WWF games were copying Mortal Kombat at the time, this feels a lot like a Virtua Fighter game. I don't know, it looks kinda rough to play and critics gave it mixed reviews, with GameSpot saying that it's alright, while GamePro thought it was great. World Tour for the N64 would be the first wrestling game made by Aki. The game's most important feature is that all moves start from a base grappling position. You know, the exact thing we have today. Despite the gameplay itself having multiple issues, this is probably the game that brought the wrestling genre in a more modern era. The graphics were great for their time, there was once again a very big roster, and WCW would really start bringing the heat in the video game department. Reviews for the game ranged from middling to positive, with IGN recommending the game for its multiplayer modes, while GameSpot thought the controls were sluggish and unresponsive. 1998 would be the year that WWF regained the lead in the ratings, and it also struck back in the video game department. WWF Warzone was a game for the N64 and PS1, and it looks fantastic. It features only 16 wrestlers compared to WCW's 40+, but the gameplay looks a lot smoother than Aki's efforts. This game is also a lot more complicated than the WCW games, as most grapplers are executed after a series of D-pad presses. The grappling system itself, though, was probably inspired by World Tour. This game achieved 2 firsts. One is an actual attempt of emulating real-life commentary with Jim Ross and Vince McMahon in the booth, but it also featured the ability to create a wrestler. Warzone had slight differences between its versions, with the PS1 version having more commentary lines, while the N64 version had better graphics and 2 more modes. This game was generally enjoyed by critics, with GameSpot saying that the PlayStation version was the best wrestling package ever released, and it shouldn't be missed by anyone with even a passing interest in wrestling, while also giving the N64 version a higher score. A Game Boy version also exists, but at this point I'm tired of these Game Boy cash grabs. I mean, look, the only way to distinguish Triple H from The Rock here is the length of their hair. We had this solved in 1990. WCW would respond with 2 games, Nitro and WCW Revenge. Nitro feels like a stopgap game. Like we're right on the cusp of greatness, but first we got to talk about a steaming pile of mediocrity. Nitro is fine, it's a lot faster paced than the other WCW games due to Aki not being behind this one, but there isn't anything special here. Yes, the roster is still massive and there's a decent variety of modes, but that's about it. Moving on, if WCW World Tour ushered in a new era for wrestling games, Revenge made them cool. Despite WCW beginning its downward spiral at the time, Revenge was very popular. It took the foundation set in WCW vs. the World, improved it, and the result is a simple yet very fun game to play. The acclaimed WWF games did have the graphical edge, as well as Edge himself, but Revenge had the much better gameplay. I think Revenge instantly became the blueprint for wrestling games to follow, up until closer to the end of the PS2 era. Aki, in a matter of years, had made a giant leap, going in the complete opposite direction of WCW itself. The game generally reviewed well, but a much more important fact is that it became the 26th best-selling N64 game ever, as well as the best-selling N64 wrestling game. This would be Aki's last WCW game, with THQ acquiring the rights to publish games for a different promotion. While Aki were making their final WCW game, in 1999, Acclaim would also be publishing their final WWF game called Attitude for the PS1, N64, and GameCube for the first time ever. This game isn't anything particularly special, and I think it's way too similar to Warzone. The only highlight of the game is watching Stone Cold stumble his way into the ring with a severe lack of confidence. There's just something about this game's models that make them look really goofy. This game got mixed reviews and Next Gen particularly hated the GameCube port, saying that it's a pathetic port and the only reason the game gets 1 star is that the jewel case was reusable. Ouch. Not a good way for Acclaim's decade-long deal with the WWF to end. WCW would release 2 more games in 1999. WCW Thunder was the sequel to Nitro, and it has pretty much the same issues as its predecessors. Compared to the games that we've already seen, and the games that are yet to come, Thunder was just a way for THQ to cash in on the WCW brand name. And that it did, as the game sold about 1 million copies, and despite making some improvements and additions, it cannot compete with Aki's WCW games. The other WCW game released at the time is a bit more interesting, as it was a title published by EA Sports called WCW Mayhem. It's a surprisingly solid game. The character models may be nightmare fuel, the camera is way too close to the action and the gameplay is appropriately janky for someone's first attempt at making a wrestling game, but other than that, I expected a lot worse. The gameplay is decent enough, and the game's main draw is the ability to fight in backstage areas. Mayhem got a mixed response, with some critics liking it, while others were left unamused. 1999 would see one more game release that would usher in the WWF's long relationship with THQ. Made by Aki, WrestleMania 2000 is the first game made after THQ dropped the WCW license and acquired the rights to the WWF brand. I feel like this game is unfairly forgotten. Sandwiched between Revenge and No Mercy, WrestleMania 2000 is probably just as good as these games, but for some reason fans don't treat it as such. It has a humongous roster for the WWF's then standards, including over 50 wrestlers, while also being the first game to introduce a Road to WrestleMania mode. Gameplay is very similar to Revenge, although slightly refined, and we're still in the era of terrible looking models. This game also includes the most in-depth wrestler creator we've seen so far, with the added feature to also customize his moveset. Critics were major fans of the N64 version of the game, and the less said about the Game Boy Color version, the better. With the Monday Night War wrapping up, I thought that the amount of wrestling games released would decrease, as the WWF would most likely sit on their laurels. But they must have been selling like hotcakes, because between the year 2000 and 2003, the WWF published 16 wrestling games. Before we get into them, let's get the obvious one out of the way first. WCW Backstage Assault was the last game made before WCW was sold off to the WWF, and it's also the worst. In fact, it may be the worst wrestling game of all time. You know how Mayhem was the first to do backstage areas? Well, Backstage Assault only has backstage areas and no ring, because why would a wrestling game have a wrestling ring? I don't know about you guys, but I always found backstage areas in wrestling games to be a bit of a novelty. They're cool the first few times around, but in the end, I always want to go back to the ring. Backstage Assault being backstage only is a complete misunderstanding of what wrestling fans wanted. Not that the actual WCW was doing better in that department in 2000. The game somehow manages to be a downgrade in almost every way to Mayhem, and it mirrors WCW in the year 2000. A cell of its former self that really has no idea what it's doing. You probably didn't need me to tell you that the critics hated this one, but hey, it's the first one that we can use Metacritic on, so at least it did something right. On the other side, the WWF would release two back-to-back PlayStation 1 exclusives right before the PS2 launched. WWF Smackdown is the first WWF game developed by Hughes, and it would signal the beginning of a 20-year-long relationship with the company. Its gameplay is a lot faster paced than the Aki games, and it has the feeling of an arcade game. This lightning fast pace was very appropriate for the Smash Mouth style of the Attitude Era. Hughes was making New Japan Pro Wrestling games before this, and their expertise shows. This game sold and reviewed very well, and it more than showed Hughes' potential for the future. 8 months later, Hughes released a sequel to Smackdown called Smackdown 2 Know Your Role. With modern development times, it's weird seeing a sequel released within 8 months of the original, but it just comes to show how easy it was to develop games at the time. Know Your Role is obviously very similar to Smackdown in terms of gameplay. Where it differs is the addition of a bunch of modes that fleshed out the experience. Know Your Role also tried to expand the season mode, adding cutscenes and some storylines, but critics universally agreed that the season mode was the worst part of the game. Critics, however, adored this one, and it stands at a staggering 90 on Metacritic. You'd think that N64 owners would be feeling left out with all these PlayStation exclusives, but I guess not, because 2000 would also be the year of WWF No Mercy's release. This game is really good. So good in fact that a rival company would use it as a blueprint for their game 20 years later. Gameplay is very similar to that of Revenge in WrestleMania 2000, but I think it's No Mercy's story mode that makes it stand out from the rest. The game features a bunch of storylines that are just fun and interesting to experience. Arguably better than what we have now. The game did have some technical issues due to the N64's limitations, especially with 4 wrestlers on the screen, but I doubt anybody remembers or even cares. No Mercy was exciting to play while also providing a great story mode for wrestling game standards. You can't ask more than that. Expectedly, critics loved No Mercy when it came out. That would be Aki's final wrestling game, and nobody really knows why. There are a lot of rumors around Aki not working with THQ anymore. one that went around the internet, was that Aki was in the midst of making a sequel to No Mercy that was cancelled, and another one that EA contacted Aki to make a WCW game after Backstage Assault was a disaster, but the most likely option is that THQ saw that the Yuke's games were more profitable, so they decided to focus on that partnership. Aki would end up working with EA to make the well-received Def Jam games, before slowly transitioning into a mobile game company. 2000 would also be the year that the final WWF arcade game was made, called WWF Royal Rumble. There's not a lot to talk about here. There's only 2 modes, the roster is about as big as that of the 90s games, and there's even a Dreamcast version that's not a lot better. Gameplay is fine, but at this point I feel like we've seen obviously better home console games and better arcade games. Royal Rumble got a middling response by critics. While WCW was about to be sold off, we had the rise of another company during that time, ECW. ECW would never compete with the WWF, but we did get 2 games from it during that period. Both of these games were made and published by Acclaim. They were fresh off losing the WWF license, and they were out to prove everybody wrong with ECW Hardcore Revolution. They proved everybody wrong by releasing a reskin of WWF Attitude. That'll teach them. Yeah, wrestling games evolved quickly during that time, and what was passable in 1999 just wasn't cutting it a year later. This game somehow manages to be a sanitized version of ECW, where there is not a lot of excitement. I feel like Ukes during that era could have made an incredible ECW game because their styles meshed well. Acclaim, not so much. I do find some of the pre-match promos to be funny though, especially Lance Storm struggling to remember where his hometown is.
How can someone like you match skills with someone from Calgary, Alberta, Canada?
About 6 months later, Acclaim would be back with ECW Anarchy Rules, because during that era, switching an S with a Z was considered to be the epitome of cool. Anyways, this game is another reskin with more modes. I appreciate the effort, but there was just no saving this franchise. Acclaim didn't really try to improve the gameplay, and the results are unsurprisingly not up to par. Both games reviewed terribly. For only a year, WWF games went through a very short-lived golden age. You had both Ukes and Aki firing on all cylinders, but with the latter now out of the picture, the landscape for these games would change significantly. Now, instead of getting 2 or 3 great games in a year, we'd have the really good Ukes game, followed by a mediocre ones made specifically to fill the gap between Ukes releases. Wrestling games were selling well, and the WWF was not going to miss out on these profits. Starting off 2001, we had WWF with Authority. There's not a lot of footage of this game online, just an ancient GameSpot review of it. This is an online card game, published just before card games started booming. I can't really understand what's going on, but critics didn't really like this game. Servers were shut down just 2 years later, but the game still had a few loyal fans that kept playing it via peer-to-peer connection. I guess we could call this a predecessor to WWE Supercard, the mobile card game that's been going on for quite some time now. The WWF would also release 2 Game Boy games that year. First up, we have WWF Betrayal for the Game Boy Color. I know I've been critical of the Game Boy games so far, but they actually tried with this one. It's a beat 'em up using WWF wrestlers where Stephanie McMahon is essentially treated as Princess Peach as you go on an adventure to save her after being kidnapped. The presentation of this game is adorable as you see all these well-made sprites of known wrestlers. The gameplay is very simplistic though. It's obviously not going to win any awards, but I expected a lot worse. I'll give this one a pass. The other game made for the Game Boy family of consoles was WWF Road to WrestleMania. Again, very simple gameplay, but there's a lot of modes, the presentation is nice, and I'd be lying if I said I wouldn't spend hours on this if I had this when I was a kid. I played the TNA mobile game for hours upon hours, and I know for a fact it wasn't better than this. Both this game and Betrayal got middling reviews, although Road to WrestleMania was received slightly better than Betrayal. It wouldn't be a year in wrestling if Ukes didn't release a game, and we're rounding up 2001 with Smackdown Just Bring It. This would be the first WWF game released on the PS2, and you can immediately feel the technological leap. First of all, characters don't look derpy anymore, as they now do have a resemblance to the person they're representing. Other than that, more people could be in the ring at the same time, as well as having an abundance of never before seen customization options. Season mode was replaced by story mode, and it's a neat idea that allowed wrestlers to go on a more personalized journey. The game has the same arcade gameplay of Ukes' previous games, and I can't really understand why it wasn't received as well as the games before and after it. Critics liked it, just not as much as any other Ukes game of the era. 2002 would be the beginning of the aforementioned stopgap games. First up, we have WWF Raw. For its era, the game's presentation and graphics are top notch, even if The Rock walks like he has lumbago. Other than that, it's mediocre. Like WCW Mayhem, I find the camera to be way too close to the action, and the gameplay in general can't compete with Yuke's titles. It looks like an improved version of the Acclaim games. It's not bad by any means, it's just that the competition was a lot better. This would also be the last WWF game released on PCs until WWE 2K15, and critics gave it a lukewarm response. Raw would be followed by WWF WrestleMania 18 for the GameCube. It was Yuke's first attempt at making a game for the Nintendo consoles, and they tried emulating Aki's style. They even hired some ex-Aki developers to help with the process, and although the result is generally solid, I feel like this game was rushed. Gameplay is a downgraded version of the Aki games, but the real kicker is the lack of any story mode. Aki's No Mercy storylines were fun, and the same could be said about the PlayStation Yuke's games. It's a shame that there's nothing here, and my guess is this game was rushed to release during WrestleMania season. That guess would be very wrong, because the game released 3 months after WrestleMania 18 in North America. Yuke's probably just didn't care about Nintendo then. Critics were also left generally unimpressed with this title, although it did have its fans. The real heat would be brought with Smackdown Shut Your Mouth. I'm running out of things to say about this lineage of games. Yuke's found the formula, it was clearly working very well for them, and they stuck to it. The big addition to this game was the entire Raw brand, which meant that in career mode, you could get drafted and only wrestle against brand-specific wrestlers. Entrances look great in this game, and that's about it. It's a really good game, just not that different from what came before. However, this is an important game for historical purposes, as it's the first one to get the F out and use the WWE name and branding. Other games released previously in that era were also forced to make the switch when re-released, although none of them changed their in-game branding. 2002 will also see the release of another Game Boy Advance game called WWE Road to WrestleMania 18. This is an improvement over Road to WrestleMania in every way. It had a control system that was reminiscent of the Aki games, and it made the best it could out of the Game Boy Advance's 2-button system. This is also probably the best reviewed handheld wrestling game, with reviewers liking it. Kinda sad that the highest praise a handheld wrestling game got was that it was good, but I don't think anybody in the WWE cared enough to give a company the proper budget and time to try. Most handheld wrestling games made during that time were made to lure people in with their brand name, only to deliver a passable product. This is as good as it gets, unfortunately. 2003 would be off to a weird start, because this is the year we got WWE Crush Hour. I had no idea this game existed before making this video, but I love the idea. This is a vehicular combat game where every wrestler has their own unique vehicle, and I just love that this game exists. Let me get this straight, this is not a good game. Vehicle controls are floaty, and their guns have no visible impact on your opponent's cars to the point that you'd think you're firing marshmallows. But just seeing all these wrestlers in their goofy cars driving around wacky arenas is just great. All with the commentary of Jim Ross. Critics hated this one, but I feel like they didn't appreciate the novelty of having a twisted metal game with WWE wrestlers. Crush Hour would be followed by WWE Raw 2. This is just a slightly improved version of the game we talked about previously. Similar strengths and issues, there isn't much to say here. A season mode was added, but there wasn't any story to sink your teeth into. It did have great customization features compared to other WWE games of the time, but that's about it. An okay game that reviewed okayishly and held people over until the next Yuke's game. And hold people over it did, as we got the second Yuke's GameCube game called WWE WrestleMania 19. WrestleMania 19 is frankly an insane game. Yeah, the gameplay may not be as good as the Aki games, but at this point it doesn't matter because we got Revenge Mode. Revenge Mode is the game's campaign where you're fired from the WWE and you hatch a plan with Stephanie McMahon to ruin that year's WrestleMania. It's by far the craziest thing any wrestling game has done. In this mode, you go around beating up construction workers and other wrestlers in order to get what you want. This is what Backstage Assault would be like if it was good. The game reviewed fairly well, and even now in 2025, we need more of this, please. 2003 will also be the year that we got Smackdown Here Comes the Pain. This is arguably the peak of professional wrestling games. It's a combination of all of Yuke's experience, all put in a single PS2 disc. The gameplay is excellent, career mode is dumb fun, and I did a video on it that you can watch if you want a more in-depth review. In the prism of this video though, Here Comes the Pain is not that different from all the other Smackdown games. But if you're going to replay a game from that era, this is the one. 2004 would start off with WWE Day of Reckoning, Yuke's next attempt at a GameCube game. This is a solid game overall. Gameplay is the usual Nintendo WWE game style, although punches and kicks in this game have much greater impact. Even clapping in this game has more impact than putting someone through a table. This is also the first game to introduce the classic story where you go from developmental to the top of the WWE ladder. There's no voice acting in the story, and a lot of scenes don't even have any background noise, making you think that your speakers are broken. Revenge mode will be missed, but at the time, going for a more traditional WWE story made sense. The game received quite positive reviews. This would be the year that we also got the final WWE Game Boy Advance game called WWE Survivor Series. This game went back to a mixed response from critics, and I couldn't really tell you why. It's the same game essentially as Road to WrestleMania 18, with not a lot of changes. I mean, I guess they found an alright formula and stuck with it. Not a lot to say here. And with that, another era of WWE games came to an end. From now on, less games will be released under the WWE banner in an attempt to have quality over quantity. To give you a better understanding of that, in the first 17 years since the release of the first WWE game, 39 separate games were released during that time. In the 20 years following that, only 25 games were published. So, get ready as we take a plunge into a new era. With the brand split occurring in 2002, the Smackdown brand just wasn't cutting it anymore for Yuke's flagship title. We needed something more, and thus we got the first Smackdown vs Raw game. Not a lot changed from Here Comes the Pain. There's a new camera angle that has carried over to the modern games and fresh new stories for the story mode. My issue for this more modern era of games is that it's going to be harder and harder to find interesting things to say about them. Yuke's found a formula that worked for both them and the fans and just kept slightly iterating upon it. The games that we're talking about now are obviously better, but it does kinda make you appreciate in a weird way the times where the quality of a WWE game was based on pure luck. Thankfully, to ease my concerns, WWE WrestleMania 21 was released and it was pretty bad. It's a spiritual sequel to the Raw games made by a new dev, and it took the already mediocre Raw games and made them worse. The gameplay is the main culprit here, as it's simply not fun to play. Bundle that in with bad hit detection and you got yourself WrestleMania 21. One cool thing about this game though is that the story mode cutscenes are fully voice acted. I was looking for performances to make fun of, but nothing really sticks out. Yeah, there are some wrestlers that are clearly reading from a script in one take like RVD.
As you know, Cole, anybody can have an off night. And no offense to Ray, but I wasn't even in the ring the whole time during that match. It's been too long since RVD's worn singles gold, but that's gonna come to an end at the next pay-per-view.
But for every Rob Van Dam, there's a Rene Dupree that got really into it.
I can't believe that someone like you would come in here on his first day and speak to Rene Dupree like this. I will be happy to meet you in the ring tonight and make you the laughingstock of the locker room by beating you in your first match. Tuh!
The game was received about as well as the aforementioned Raw games. Moving on, we had WWE Aftershock for the N-Gage. Now, what is an N-Gage, I hear you ask? I have no idea. Let me go look it up and I'll be right back. So the Nokia N-Gage is half phone, half gaming device, and all terrible. For a gaming device, it couldn't match the Game Boy Advance's capabilities, and as a phone, it was simply too big and weird to be carried around as a daily device. WWE Aftershock was a game released on this, and oh my god, what is that nightmare fuel. I would like to take the time to formally apologize to all the WWE Game Boy games, because what is this? On a now taken down page on Metacritic, Aftershock got mixed reviews by critics and very positive reviews from the 7 people that played it. This honestly tells me more about the expected quality of the N-Gage games than the game itself. We're not out of the woods with gimmicky wrestling games yet, as next up is WWE Plug and Play. As the name says, you plug this thing into your TV and you play. This is more of a toy than a game, and it was even marketed along Jakks Pacific's toy lineup for the year. There's not a lot of meat here, but it is a decently fun game for what it is. Following Plug and Play, we had the release of the final GameCube game called WWE Day of Reckoning 2. A sequel to Day of Reckoning, I believe this is the only WWE game where the story picks up directly after the ending of the first game. There's still no voice acting, but at the very least ambient noise was added to the cutscenes. Gameplay's alright in general, but what stuck out to me was the newly added stamina bar. It makes the gameplay look like it's ripped straight from the PS4 WWE 2K games. I was never a fan of this system, but it comes to show that despite being considered the lesser games to the Smackdown series, that and the introduction of the Zero to Hero storyline comes to show that the GameCube games had a much larger impact on the future of the franchise than it originally seems. Day of Reckoning 2 received generally positive reviews. After the release of Day of Reckoning 2, THQ and Yuke's would focus solely on the Smackdown vs. Raw series. Smackdown vs. Raw 2006 is next up, and this game would attempt to shake the series up. Yuke tried to go with a more realistic approach here, and even though the gameplay space is still a lot quicker than that of Day of Reckoning 2, you can tell a tangible effort was made here. Smackdown vs. Raw 06's gameplay would act as the baseline for all the other Smackdown vs. Raw games. Story mode was back, this time with voice acted cutscenes, which again are surprisingly fine, and even more importantly, we had the introduction of GM mode. This mode instantly became a fan favorite, and fans clamored for its return once we lost it a few years later. There's even a PSP version of the game that looks and plays shockingly similar to the console version, so kudos for that. Both the PS2 and PSP versions of Smackdown vs. Raw 06 got very positive reviews. Smackdown vs. Raw 2007 is slightly disappointing to me. It just doesn't innovate as much as its predecessor. It's still a very good game, I just don't see a lot of justification to upgrade from 06. Two major features that were added were the ability to directionally throw your opponent and the ability to fight into the crowd. Both cool things, just nothing too exciting. It would be, however, the first WWE game released on the then next-gen consoles, releasing for the PS2, PSP, and Xbox 360. Smackdown vs. Raw 2008 would be the first fully next-gen game in the series. You know how you could tell the difference when other games made the technological leap? Well, with Smackdown vs. Raw 2008, it's a bit more difficult to do so because the graphics are better, but not by a lot. Again, not a lot of innovation on display here, as Yuke's had fully settled into making a slightly improved version of their previous game. This would be the first game to include WWE ECW for better or worse, as well as different fighting styles that would change the available moves that each wrestler could perform. For some odd reason, Story Mode and ZM Mode were merged into one, where you had the choice to play either as a wrestler or a manager. This would also be GM Mode's final appearance in a WWE game until WWE 2K22. There's also an odd feature exclusive to the PS3 version where you can choose to watch an entrance in first person while controlling what you see using motion controls. It's a nice novelty that it's there, but it's a shame that a first person mode was never expanded upon. Smackdown vs. Raw 2009 would continue the trend of good but unremarkable WWE games, but there are a few key points to talk about here. First off, GM mode was not in this game, instead replaced by Road to WrestleMania. This mode holds a special place in my heart. It's usually 5 2-hour stories that are personalized for each wrestler that stars in them. These stories are always interesting and appropriately cheesy. This would mean, however, that career mode was noticeably of lower effort, as most cutscenes went to Road to WrestleMania. From the gameplay side of things, it was the tag team mode that got the most love with an abundance of changes, but I've been very vocal about how tag team wrestling sucked in WWE games until 2K24, and I stand by that. Smackdown vs. Raw 2009 would also be the first game to introduce the short-lived option to create a finisher. I've spent countless hours on this mode creating some unspeakable monstrosities, and I think it's a feature that's sorely lacking from today's games. Smackdown vs. Raw 07, 08, and 09 were received relatively well, but we're slowly but surely moving away from the golden era of WWE games. Not to worry, as a new competitor to the WWE games would arise. In 2008, TNA had picked up major traction. It would firmly establish itself as a number 2 promotion in the US, with hopes of challenging for the number 1 spot. And as every self-respecting wrestling promotion, TNA had to have its own video game. According to a 2005 IGN article, TNA failed to reach an agreement with EA or Rockstar to make their game, instead ending up with Midway. And just like half of that developer's name, the game was made. Even though TNA Impact looks good, its gameplay is very wonky, and despite the Smackdown vs. Raw games being a bit stale at the time, you had to nail the gameplay if you wanted to compete with them. An interesting feature of the game was tying in the game's story mode with real life. In the story mode, you play as Suicide, who gets beat up so bad that he forgets who he is and has to start anew. TNA would use the Suicide character in real life to cross-promote the game, and he even won the X Division Championship. This had never been done before, and I doubt it will ever happen again. TNA Impact got pretty mediocre reviews, and despite selling well, a sequel was never made due to Midway going under in 2009. Back to the WWE side of things, in between their Smackdown vs. Raw games, Yuke's would also make WWE Legends of WrestleMania. In this mode, you could exclusively use Legends while reliving or changing what happened in certain WrestleMania matches. This game would be the prototype for the showcase mode we have now, but it also has some major flaws. The most notable one is that it's boring. Yuke's went with a much more simpler control scheme within the Smackdown vs. Raw games, potentially to bring non-gamers in, but the result is just a very uninteresting game to play. The game was received worse than the Smackdown vs. Raw games, but another one would be releasing soon. Smackdown vs. Raw 2010 is once again another solid entry into the franchise. I remember loving Edge's Road to WrestleMania because it was the only way to play as a referee. We also got the ability to create our own story, which hasn't been replicated since, as well as the ability to download other creations made by the community. This is still one of the best features to ever be added in any game, and although I understand the issues with moderating this type of stuff, I wish more games in general would implement this. Smackdown vs. Raw 2010 got about the same reviews as the other games of the series. Now, nearly all of the Smackdown vs. Raw games were getting ported over to the Wii, the DS, and the PSP, and all these ports are surprisingly fine. There are obviously worse ways to play these games, but they got the job done. TNA, however, decided they wanted to release a handheld exclusive with TNA Impact Cross the Line being available only for the PSP and Nintendo DS. The game is essentially a port of the 2008 game, and it shares the same issues that it had. While the wonkier gameplay could have been more easily forgiven on the handheld consoles, critics didn't seem to agree as they gave this game even worse reviews than the home console version. Some people believe that No Mercy is the best wrestling game, others Here Comes the Pain, while my unpopular opinion is that Smackdown vs. Raw 2011 should at least be in the conversation. My main reason for this is the game's physics engine that, for reasons that still elude me, was only used for this game. This engine made every object in the game interactable without having to trigger specific animations. If you landed any move close to a chair, for example, the opponent would land on that chair. This sometimes led to janky results, but it was so much fun to experiment with that the jankiness was part of the fun. Universe Mode was also added, and it has been a staple of the WWE games ever since, and we also got the Road to WrestleMania that gave you the option to play as a heel Rey Mysterio. I love this game, and 2K, I don't care how much you have to downgrade the graphics, we need those physics back. In between major releases, we also got another excellent WWE game during that time called WWE All-Stars. The premise of this game is that legends of the past fight current wrestlers in dream matches. Instead of going with the boring approach of Legends of WrestleMania, Yuke's opted for unrealistic, over-the-top action, and it's great. Seeing all these wrestlers perform these over-exaggerated moves is a lot of fun. I just wish this game offered more replayability. It really lacked in creation feature compared to the main games. This lack of features would prevent All-Stars from getting anything better than positive reviews. 2011 would be time for a rebrand for the Smackdown vs. Raw games, as they would be renamed to simply WWE, starting with WWE 12. This is by far the wrestling game I sunk the most hours into, playing about 500 matches in the game's barely functioning servers, another staple of the franchise. Looking back, I don't think this game is as good as Smackdown vs. Raw 2011, although it did add some interesting stuff. Most interesting of all was the ability to interrupt moves, especially those where the wrestlers had to run towards the ropes to perform them. I still remember watching tutorials on how to perform the 619. However, removing the physics engine is just way too big of a flaw to ignore. Critics were also a bit more down on the game, with many criticizing Yuke's for simply going through the motions. WWE 13 would also not really shake things up. Road to WrestleMania was replaced by the Attitude Era mode, which was solid. I just wish they could find a way to make both modes coexist. Gameplay wise, nothing of substance really changed, and generally I remember being disappointed by this game when it came out. It just didn't have the same magic as Smackdown vs. Raw 2011 and WWE 12 had, and maybe this would be the beginning of a decline for the franchise. This would be THQ's last WWE game before going bankrupt. They sold off all of their IPs, and the WWE license went to 2K. Let's see how 2K fared with their newly acquired IP. 2K would get off to a red hot start with WWE 2K14 as the game is really good. 2K kept Yuke's as the lead developer of the game, so we didn't get a lot of changes on the gameplay side of things. Instead, we got the 30 years of WrestleMania mode where you play through key matches through the event's history, as well as the streak mode where you either pick a wrestler to beat a super beefed up version of The Undertaker, or try to keep the streak alive by beating as many wrestlers as you can in a gauntlet match. Even though this game was published under the 2K banner, this does feel like a last hurrah for the THQ games, especially since what followed would act as the baseline for the next generation of WWE games. WWE was a bit late to the next gen console party. Both the PS4 and Xbox One were out when WWE 2K14 released, but the game was not available for these consoles. So, WWE 2K15 would be the first next gen WWE game. Now, when talking about the worst wrestling games, among others Backstage Assault gets thrown around a lot, as well as WWE 2K20, but I don't think WWE 2K15 being also quite bad is talked about enough. This game was published with almost none of the creation features of the previous games, and the lowlight of this game has to be the career mode. Career mode is so bad that it does a complete 180 and becomes a perfectly accurate simulation of 2015 WWE, where not being a main event guy meant that management had nothing for you. Seriously, the GM of your brand would come up to you and tell you that there's nothing for you to do while you sit in catering twiddling your thumbs. Not that the gameplay is much better. 2K15 was the first to introduce a much slower pace to matches where the stamina bar would prevent you from having fun. This style does have its fans, and I'm definitely not one of them. This game showcased two rivalries, Triple H vs Shawn Michaels and John Cena vs CM Punk, with Punk having quit the company about 10 months before the game was out. Critics were also not fans of this one. WWE 2K16 would be an upgrade, but the bar was not set very high. Some customization features would return, but others, like Create a Finisher, are still missing to this day. WWE 2K16 had a showcase centered around Stone Cold and an improved career mode. Reversal limits would also be first introduced here, something that again, I'm not too crazy on. This game was received slightly better than 2K15, but the jump to next-gen consoles had not been kind to Hughes. With 2016 rolling around, 2K17 was another meh game. It dropped Showcase mode completely and added it back as DLC, while the gameplay and career mode were not really lighting the world on fire. The ability to cut promos was added, which was fun, but yet again the 2K WWE games just couldn't compete with past games. Once more, the game got a lukewarm reception, and how could it not? 2K18 was more of the same, and this time no Showcase mode was present, DLC or not. Career mode was also the usual stuff, and there's not a lot to 2K18. The Smackdown vs Raw games were becoming stale, but at least they were stale while still being good games. The 2K games quickly became stale while also being very mediocre. The most interesting fact about this game is that it had a virtually unplayable Switch port. Critics were once again not moved by 2K18. There was light in this tunnel, however, as in 2018 would be the year that WWE 2K19 was released. Granted, among the PS4 era WWE 2K games, this is by far the best one. The gameplay for its style is good, Showcase mode was back, and there's a more fleshed out career mode. I personally think this game is solid, but I think it gets a bit overrated due to the fact that WWE 2K20 was terrible when it launched. I made a video about my grievances with 2K19, so I don't want to go more in depth here, but at least Yuke's was trending towards a more positive direction. Well, I was wrong about the direction Yuke's was heading because they were heading straight towards the exit. Yuke's left after a 20-year relationship with the WWE, and Visual Concepts had to pick up the pieces. The end result was a broken mess. Bugs, glitches, everything that could have gone wrong went wrong, and the game managed to break out of the wrestling niche into the mainstream simply due to how bad of a state it was in when it launched. It featured a career mode that was similar to 2K19, a showcase mode centered around the Force Horsewoman, and to be honest, after a boatload of patches, it's not that bad anymore. It's just a worse version of 2K19. Still, this would send 2K into crisis mode, and we wouldn't get another installment in the main franchise for 2 more years after this. Still, we did get one more game during that time. 2K would use the same team that made the fun NBA Playgrounds games to make WWE Battlegrounds a more arcade take on the WWE similar to All-Stars. While this game can be fun to play at times, its biggest problem is having most of its roster locked behind a paywall that you can either grind for or pay to skip entirely. This would lead to Battlegrounds not being well received at all and put 2K in even hotter waters with back-to-back misses. 2021 would be the first year since 1997 that we got no WWE games, and with 2022 rolling around, 2K22 was a make or break game. And I mean that because it was heavily rumored at the time that the WWE wanted to switch video game partners and 2K22's quality would decide 2K's future. Fortunately for 2K, 2K22 is pretty good. It ditches the slower paced style of the PS4 era games and brings back a more arcade feeling to matches. In hindsight though, this does feel like a demo. All the modes you'd want are here, with a Rey Mysterio showcase, multiple career modes and even the return of GM mode, but all of them are very bare bones. And in this new era of games, you can tell that Visual Concepts is still figuring things out. 2K23 would basically make 2K22 obsolete by adding more features and making the gameplay better. It was John Cena's turn for a showcase mode, and I really appreciated the ability to fight Super Cena in the end of it. Other than that, it's 2K22 with fully fleshed out modes. Both of these games were received a lot more positively by critics. Before we can talk about 2K24, there is still one more game we have to talk about. In 2019, AEW would be created, and soon thereafter they would be making a wrestling game using WWF No Mercy as the blueprint. Yuke's would even be back to make it. I've talked extensively about this game, its flaws, the terrible monetization, the decent multiplayer, and you can watch these videos if you're interested. The short version is that AEW Fight Forever is simply not a good wrestling game. The story mode storylines seem like they were written on a 5-minute bathroom break, a lot of wrestlers that I'd want to play as are priced at around $10, but it can be fun at times and the multiplayer somehow works better than that of the WWE games when people are playing it. Otherwise, it's a shame because it would have been nice to have a fully arcade competitor to the WWE games. Finally, we have arrived at WWE 2K24. I generally enjoyed 2K24. As 2K23 before it, it kinda makes the previous installments obsolete as it fixes a lot of things while adding even more features. I love throwing stuff in this game. I know it existed in older wrestling games, but the sheer velocity that objects have in this game is hilarious. We're at the point where wrestling games are good again, but I still think there's another gear to be reached. Fixing the servers would be an easy slam dunk in my opinion for 2K, as well as trying to make more fleshed out stories for my rise. I'm hopeful about 2K25 and I will be covering it on the channel when it comes out. 2K were inconsiderate enough to announce new information about WWE 2K25, and so I'm recording this with the rest of the video almost complete. A lot of new match types were announced, like Bloodline Rules matches, intergender matches, underground matches, and also some old stuff coming back like jumping off barricades or chain wrestling. But the thing that I wanted to focus on was the newly announced island. The island will probably be the same thing as the city in the NBA 2K games, and to be honest, I'm not really a big fan of the cities in these games. I see them as glorified loading screens that make it longer for you to get to the actual interesting part of the game, but in a wrestling scenario, the potential is limitless. I thought I could get through the whole video without talking about it, but Wrestling Empire should be the blueprint for this. You should be able to go around and attack other wrestlers or interact with more formal alliances, and that should also affect your condition before the match, or other wrestlers should be able to attack you before a match. The possibilities are endless, and I think you can either take Wrestling Empire as a blueprint or Street Fighter 6 if you want a AAA game, and I think if they do that, and I don't know if the technology is available for that we're gonna have one of the best wrestling games ever. At least it shows that 2K is not content with staying with the same game and they're constantly adding stuff, and I'm excited to see how they handle this island. At the very least, this confirms to me that they fixed the servers, because I don't know how you do this type of thing without having servers. Anyways, they also showed us the Bloodline cover of the game, and wait, is that? Okay, disregard everything I just said, this is gonna be the best game of the year, best game ever, best game of the decade, best game. And that would be the history of the WWE games. Due to the nature of the video, I couldn't analyze these games in depth, as it would probably take years to play and talk about all 82 games. What did occur to me while making this video though was that wrestling games are a mirror of their respective promotions. Whenever the business was doing well, wrestling games quality was usually better. In the mid-2010s, things were bad, and wrestling games somehow managed to follow. Even now that the business is picking up again, breaking records and getting fans invested in storylines, WWE games are also on an upwards trajectory. It's not a perfect science, but for example, Revenge came out when WCW was good, and Backstage Assault was released during its absolute worst year. 2019 was a really bad year for the WWE, and 2K20 only added to the problems. So if you take away something from this video, is that if the wrestling game you're playing is good, chances are you'll also like the real life product as well. Thank you for watching the video. This took a long time to make, and I probably won't attempt to cover this many games in one video again. The original idea was doing all wrestling games, but there's just too many. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.